The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of beeswax and wilted roses. It was the third grand event of the season, and Eleanor Vance felt as though she had been holding the same silver candlestick for an eternity, its base growing warm and slick in her gloved hand. Her sister, Rosamond, was a vision in pale silk, a planet with a dozen orbiting moons in the form of eager young gentlemen. Rosamond did not need a candle. She generated her own light. Eleanor, 2 years her senior, perpetually clad in dove gray or muted lavender, served as the fixed point from which her sister's brilliance could be measured. She was not resentful. Resentment was a turbulent emotion, and Eleanor preferred the quiet currents of observation. From her post near the French doors, she could see the entire social ecosystem laid bare. The anxious mothers with their feathered fans beating like frantic wings. The fathers clustered near the card tables, their talk of politics a low, rumbling thunder. The young women, their smiles as carefully arranged as the pearls at their throats. And at the center of it all, the new celestial body that had pulled everyone into its orbit, the Duke of Alastair. He had been in the country less than a month, having inherited the title from a distant cousin. Rumor preceded him like an outrider, whispering of vast estates in the north, a fortune made in shipping, and a disposition as cold and unforgiving as the sea from which his wealth had been wrested. He was not handsome in the way of the young dandies who flocked around Rosamond. His face was a composition of severe lines and stark angles. His eyes, a gray so deep they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He moved with an economy of motion that made the preening of other men look ridiculous. He was speaking to Lord Ashworth, his back to much of the room, yet his presence was a weight that altered the very atmosphere. Eleanor watched as Rosamond, with a practiced and perfect grace, detached herself from her admirers and drifted toward him. It was a masterful performance of seeming happenstance. Her laughter, a sound like wind chimes, carried across the room. The Duke turned. Eleanor saw the moment his eyes fell on her sister. It was a look of assessment, cool and clinical, the kind a man might give a thoroughbred horse before a purchase. There was no warmth, no flicker of the admiration Rosamond was so accustomed to receiving. Yet he did not turn away. He inclined his head, a gesture of polite acknowledgement, and Rosamond, undeterred, began to speak. Eleanor shifted her weight. The candle flickered, casting her own shadow, long and distorted, against the brocade curtains. She was accustomed to being a shadow. Her father, a man who had loved books more than society, had taught her the value of quiet spaces. He had shown her how to balance a ledger, how to read a land survey, how to find the soul of a household in its inventories and records. "Beauty fades, Eleanor," he used to say, his finger tracing a line of neat script in a calfskin-bound book. "But competence is a fortress." Her father was gone now, and the fortress felt very far away. All that remained with the ledgers, the house with its thinning carpets, and the pressing need for Rosamond to marry well. The Duke's gaze swept the room, a brief, dismissive tour. It passed over Eleanor without pausing, as if she were no more than a part of the furniture, a functional object holding a light. And, in a way, she was. She was the one who ensured Rosamond's gowns were perfectly pressed, who managed the dwindling household budget to afford the silk and the pearls, who stood in the background to make her sister appear all the more luminous. The candle holder. Later, as the orchestra played a waltz, she saw him standing alone in the gallery, observing a portrait of some forgotten ancestor. Rosamond was dancing with the Viscount, her face flushed with triumph. Eleanor slipped out of the ballroom, needing a moment of quiet. She moved through the gallery, her soft slippers making no sound on the marble floor. She intended to pass by him, to find a quiet alcove, but Lord Ashworth joined the Duke, his voice hearty and oblivious. "A stunning creature, Your Grace," Ashworth said, nodding toward the distant, spinning figure of Rosamond. "The loveliest flower of the season." The Duke did not turn. He continued to study the portrait. "Flowers wither," he said, his voice low and devoid of inflection. "Ah, but what a bloom in the meantime. And the family is respectable, if not wealthy. There is another sister, I believe." Eleanor froze behind a marble column, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. "Yes," the Duke said. A pause. "The one holding the candle. A necessary shadow, I suppose. Plain, but functional." The words were not cruel in their intent. They were worse. They were a simple statement of fact, a final, indifferent assessment delivered with the same dispassion he might use to describe a chair or a footstool. Plain, but functional. A necessary shadow. The fortress her father had spoken of crumbled to dust, leaving her exposed and shivering in the cold draft of his judgment. She turned, the candlestick still in her hand, and retreated into the darkness from which he had already consigned her. The flame guttered, and for a moment she was completely invisible. The morning after the ball, the house was filled with a brittle, exhausted silence. Sunlight streamed through the drawing-room windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the faint, web-like cracks in the ceiling plaster. Rosamond was still abed, recovering from her triumphs. Eleanor had been up since dawn, poring over the household accounts at her father's small, scarred desk. The numbers told a grim story. A slow, elegant decline into insolvency. The ball gowns, the carriage rentals, the carefully curated illusion of prosperity. It was all a wager, a desperate gamble on Rosamond's beauty. Her mother swept into the room, her movements agitated. "He was most attentive, Eleanor. The Duke. Did you see? He spoke with her for nearly 10 minutes. Eleanor dipped her pen in the inkwell. "I saw, Mamma." "She said he was reserved, but not unkind. He asked about her interests." "And what did she tell him they were?" Eleanor asked, her eyes still on the ledger. Rosamond's interests were Rosamond. "Poetry and watercolors," her mother said, a touch too quickly. "She must make a good match. It is our only hope." The desperation in her voice was a familiar, grating sound. Eleanor did not reply. She entered a new figure into the column, a bill from the dressmaker, shockingly large. Plain, but functional. The words were etched into the back of her mind. Functional. Yes, she was. She was the functionary of this entire enterprise, the silent engine running the beautiful facade. A necessary shadow. When Rosamond finally descended late in the morning, she was radiant, wrapped in a silk dressing gown. She pirouetted into the center of the room. "He is decided, I think. Everyone was watching us. Lady Danbury's daughter looked positively green." "Did he ask to call on you?" Eleanor asked, not looking up from her work. "Not yet," Rosamond admitted, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "But he will. He simply needs encouragement." She picked up a small porcelain shepherdess from the mantelpiece, turning it over in her hands. "It is a shame he is so severe. He hardly smiles. But the duchy will make up for it." She glanced at Eleanor. "You were very quiet last night." Did you enjoy yourself? The question was an afterthought, a piece of small change tossed her way. I found it illuminating, Eleanor said. The dry note in her voice went unnoticed. Rosamond placed the shepherdess back with a soft click. Well, you must make an effort too, Nora. You cannot stand by the wall all season. No one will notice you if you make yourself invisible. The irony of the statement was so sharp, it almost made Eleanor laugh. She had not made herself invisible, she simply was. To be noticed would require a different face, a different form, a different soul. She closed the ledger. The decision had been forming in her mind since she had fled the gallery, a small, hard seed of resolve. She would not be a shadow in her own life. If the family's future rested on this precarious match, she needed to build her own. For the next week, she wrote letters, not social correspondence, but letters of inquiry. Her father had maintained a wide network of contacts, solicitors, estate managers, academics. She wrote to them all, her script neat and precise. She described her skills in archival work, estate accounting, and library management. She did not mention her family's circumstances. She presented herself not as a desperate gentlewoman, but as a competent professional seeking a position. It was a radical, almost unthinkable act for a woman of her station, but the Duke's words had severed a cord of obligation within her. She would no longer be merely functional for others. She would be functional for herself. 2 weeks later, a reply arrived. It was not from a country solicitor or a retired academic. The letter bore a heavy wax seal, the crest of a wolf's head. It was from the offices of a Mr. Abernathy, the Duke of Alister's man of business. Eleanor's breath caught. She thought it must be a mistake, perhaps an invitation for Rosamond. But the letter was addressed in a clear, masculine hand to Miss Eleanor Vance. Mr. Abernathy, it seemed, had been in correspondence with her late father's solicitor regarding a separate matter, and had heard of a Miss Vance with a peculiar set of skills. The Duke, the letter stated, had recently taken possession of Blackwood Manor, his primary seat, and found its extensive library in a state of profound disarray. The previous Duke had been a collector of magnificent appetite and zero organizational principle. They required a cataloguer, an archivist, someone with a deep understanding of historical documents and the patience to impose order on chaos. The position came with a modest salary and lodging at the manor. Was Miss Vance interested? She read the letter 3 times. It was a key, a door out of the suffocating drawing room. It was also a path leading directly into the orbit of the man who had dismissed her so completely. The thought was both terrifying and strangely satisfying. He would see her, not in a ballroom, but in her element. He would see her competence, the fortress her father had helped her build. He would see what was functional about her, and he would have to pay for it. I have accepted a position, she announced to her mother and sister that evening. Her mother dropped her embroidery. A position? What are you talking about? A governess? The horror in her voice was plain. An archivist, Eleanor corrected quietly. For the Duke of Alister, at Blackwood Manor. Rosamond stared, her teacup halfway to her lips. You are going to work for him? In his house? The idea was so foreign, so outside the bounds of their world, that she could barely process it. But he is meant to be courting me. Then my presence should not be a problem, Eleanor said, her voice steady. I will be in the library. I doubt our paths will cross. It is an opportunity for me to be of use, and to earn my own keep. The last words hung in the air, a quiet accusation. Her mother began to protest, speaking of scandal and impropriety,
but Eleanor remained resolute. For the first time, their anxieties and expectations were not her concern. The Duke of Alistair had called her a necessary shadow. Very well. She would go to his house and show him just how necessary a shadow could be. The journey north was a gradual shedding of skin.
With each mile that passed, the manicured landscapes of the south gave way to something wilder, more rugged. The trees grew taller, the hills rolled with a deeper green, and the sky seemed vast and empty. Eleanor felt her own spirit expanding to match it. The carriage rattled along the final approach to Blackwood Manor, a long, winding drive flanked by ancient oaks. And then the house appeared, rising from the landscape, not as a genteel country home, but as a fortress of gray stone, its mullioned windows like watchful eyes. It was imposing, severe, and beautiful in its austerity. It suited its master. A housekeeper, a woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun and a surprisingly gentle face, met her at the door.
"Miss Vance, I am Mrs. Gable. His Grace is not in residence. He is in London for the remainder of the month. He asked that I make you comfortable and show you to your work."
A wave of relief washed over Eleanor. She would have time to acclimate, to establish her territory before he returned. Mrs. Gable led her through a series of grand, cold rooms, their furniture draped in white dustcloths, silent as tombs.
"His Grace has not yet decided how he wishes the house to be run," the housekeeper explained. "He has only opened the west wing for his own use, and the library, of course. For you."
She pushed open a pair of enormous oak doors, and Eleanor stepped inside. She stopped, breathless. The library was a 2-story cathedral of books. Sunlight, thick with dust, streamed from a high, arched window, illuminating shelves that soared to a vaulted ceiling. Books were everywhere, stacked on tables, spilling from crates, piled in precarious towers on the floor. It was a magnificent, glorious chaos. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and neglect.
"The last Duke was a scholar of a sort," Mrs. Gable said, with a dry sniff. "He bought books faster than he could read them. There has been no catalogue since his grandfather's day."
Eleanor walked slowly into the center of the room, turning in a slow circle. It was a daunting task, a labyrinth of knowledge that had been left to decay. But she felt no fear, only a profound sense of purpose. This was a language she understood. This was a world she could command. Here, she was not plain or necessary. She was essential. She ran a gloved finger along the spine of a leather-bound volume.
"Where do I begin?"
she murmured, more to herself than to the housekeeper. Mrs. Gable watched her, a flicker of approval in her keen eyes.
"His Grace left instructions that you are to have whatever you require. Stationery, shelving, a fire lit every morning. Your rooms are in the east wing, overlooking the gardens. They are quiet."
The days that followed fell into a peaceful, monastic rhythm. Eleanor would rise early, take a solitary breakfast in a small morning room, and then lose herself in the library until dusk. She began with a single corner, clearing a large trestle table to serve as her workspace. She learned the geography of the room, the way the light moved across the floorboards throughout the day. She discovered forgotten folios of botanical drawings, first editions of philosophical treatises, travelogues from lands that no longer existed. It was a conversation with the dead, a silent communion with centuries of thought and discovery. She worked with a methodical patience that was second nature to her. She devised a system,
sorting the books by subject, size, and condition. She began the painstaking process of creating a new catalog, her handwriting a model of clarity and precision in a fresh leather-bound ledger she had brought with her. Mrs. Gable would bring her a tray at midday and tea in the afternoon, the two women exchanging only a few quiet words, yet establishing a bond of mutual respect. In this silent, ordered world, Eleanor felt more herself than she ever had in a London ballroom.
A letter arrived from Rosamond, filled with breathless accounts of parties and potential suitors. The Duke of Alister's name was mentioned several times. He had been seen at a cotillion. He had spoken to her for 5 minutes at the opera. He had not, however, called upon her. Rosamond's frustration was a thin, sharp line beneath the glittering surface of her prose. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. That world felt 1,000 miles away, a play being performed on a distant stage. Her reality was the weight of a book in her hands, the smell of dust and ink, the quiet satisfaction of a perfectly ordered shelf. She did not think of the Duke. She thought only of his books. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks into her tenure, she was perched on a tall library ladder, reaching for a slim volume of poetry wedged high on a shelf. The book was stubborn, and she had to stretch, her fingers just brushing the faded gilt spine. Suddenly, a low voice spoke from the doorway, a voice she had only heard once, but would never forget. "I would advise against that. The upper shelves are not entirely stable." Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, her body tensed on the ladder. Slowly, she turned her head. The Duke of Alister stood just inside the library, watching her. He was dressed not for town, but for the country, in a dark riding coat and boots. He looked larger here, more solid, as if the stone walls of the house were an extension of his own formidable presence. His gray eyes were fixed on her, his expression unreadable. He had returned, and her sanctuary was no longer her own. He walked into the room, his boots making a soft, authoritative sound on the wooden floor. His gaze swept over the library, taking in the changes she had wrought. The corner she had started in was now a bastion of order. Shelves cleaned, books sorted and aligned, her ledger open on the cleared table. He stopped at the table, his gloved hand hovering for a moment over the neat columns of her script before he picked up the ledger. Eleanor descended the ladder, her legs feeling unsteady. She smoothed her simple gray dress, feeling a sudden, acute awareness of her plainness. She was not a society belle here. She was an employee. "Your Grace," she said, her voice a little breathless. "I was not expecting you." "Clearly," he said, not looking at her. He was still studying her work. He flipped a page, then another. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. She felt as if her entire life's worth was contained in that book, being weighed and measured by this cold, silent man. Finally, he closed the ledger and placed it back on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge. He turned to face her. "Mr. Abernathy informed me that you were competent. It appears he understated the matter." The compliment, if it was one, was delivered with the same flat intonation as his dismissal of her at the ball. It offered no warmth, only a grudging acknowledgement of fact. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, her voice cool and formal. "I endeavor to be thorough." "I see that." He gestured to the ladder. "Find another way to retrieve that book. I will not have my archivist breaking her neck. It would be inefficient." He turned and walked out of the library without another word, leaving her alone in the vast, silent room. She stood motionless for a long time, her hand resting on the back of a chair. He had seen her work. He had called her competent. He had worried about the inefficiency of her death. It was not kindness. It was not approval. It was the detached concern of a man for a useful tool. And yet, she thought, as she looked at the ordered shelves, it was a start. He was no longer seeing a shadow. He was seeing a function. And for now, that was enough. His return changed the atmosphere of the house. Blackwood Manor, which had been a quiet, sleeping giant, began to stir. Staff were hired, the dust cloths were removed, and the scent of polish and wood smoke replaced the stale air of disuse. Yet the Duke remained a remote and solitary figure. Eleanor would hear his footsteps in the hall late at night, or catch a glimpse of him riding out toward the moors at dawn, but their paths rarely crossed. He seemed to content himself with the West Wing, leaving her in undisputed possession of the library. He would enter the room once a day, usually in the late afternoon. He never announced his arrival. He would simply be there, standing by the fireplace or gazing out the large window. He rarely spoke to her. He would select a book from the shelves she had already organized, settle into a large leather armchair by the fire, and read for an hour. Eleanor continued her work, pretending a calm she did not feel. His presence was a constant low-grade pressure, a silent observation that kept her perpetually on edge. She found herself becoming intensely aware of him. The way he turned a page with a quiet, decisive motion, the faint scent of leather and cold air that clung to him, the way the firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, making him look like a carving of some ancient, stern-faced king. She never looked at him directly, but she saw everything. One afternoon, a week after his return, he broke the silence. She was carefully repairing the spine of a fragile manuscript, her fingers deft and sure. "My father bought that in Florence," he said from his chair. "He believed it to be a lost work by Machiavelli. It is not." Eleanor glanced up, surprised. "No," she agreed softly. "The watermarks on the paper are from a Venetian mill, dated nearly a century after Machiavelli's death. But the penmanship is exquisite." She held it up. "It is a treatise on civic duty. The author argues that a man's honor is not in his title, but in his word." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cool assessment in his eyes. It might have been surprise. "You have read it?" "I am cataloging it, Your Grace. I must understand the contents to classify it correctly." She returned to her work, her heart beating a little faster. It was a small thing, a brief exchange, but it was a conversation between equals, a meeting of two minds. He had spoken to her not as an employer to an employee, but as one reader to another. The dynamic began to shift, subtly but perceptibly. His visits grew longer. Sometimes he would ask her a question about a particular text or point out an inscription she might have missed. He began to speak of the books as if they were old acquaintances, sharing anecdotes about their acquisition. He told her of his grandfather, who had nearly bankrupted the estate to purchase a Shakespeare First Folio, and his uncle, who had a disastrous passion for forged Roman histories. Through the stories of his family's books, she began to piece together a story of him. He was a man steeped in a legacy he had not chosen, burdened by a history he seemed determined to put in order. The library, she realized,
was not just a collection of books to him. It was his inheritance, his responsibility, his chaos to tame. And she was his chosen instrument. One evening, a fierce autumn storm raged outside, rattling the window panes and sending drafts snaking across the floor. Mrs. Gable had built up the fire, and the library was a warm, golden haven against the wildness of the night. Eleanor had stayed late, determined to finish sorting a particularly chaotic section of theological texts. The Duke had been in his chair for hours, reading, the silence between them comfortable now, familiar. Suddenly, he rose and walked to a small cabinet she had not yet opened. He produced a key from his waistcoat pocket, unlocked it, and withdrew a decanter of amber liquid and 2 glasses. "The storm is worsening," he said, his back to her. "You should not walk back to your rooms just yet. Will you join me in a glass of brandy?" It was not a request an employer would make of his archivist. It was an invitation. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment. "Thank you, Your Grace." He poured 2 glasses and handed one to her. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of warmth through her. She took the glass and returned to her side of the work table, while he resumed his seat by the fire. They drank in silence for a time, the only sounds the crackling of the logs and the howling of the wind. "You are not what I expected," he said at last, his voice low. Eleanor held her glass, the warmth of it seeping into her cold hands. She waited. "When Abernathy suggested you," he continued, staring into the flames, "he described you as meticulous and unassuming. He did not mention that you were formidable." The word hung in the air between them. Formidable? No one had ever called her that. Plain, quiet, sensible, but never formidable. "I am merely doing the job for which I was hired, Your Grace," she said, her voice even. "No," he said, turning his head to look at her directly. The firelight cast his face in shadow and light. "You are not merely doing a job. You are creating order. You are restoring life to this room. It is a formidable task." She met his gaze, and this time she did not look away. In the depths of his grey eyes, she saw not the cold indifference of the ballroom, but a flicker of respect, hard-won and genuine. It was more intoxicating than any brandy. It was the foundation of a new fortress, one she was building not of competence alone, but of mutual recognition. The storm raged on outside, but inside the library, something had settled. The ground beneath her feet, for the first time in a very long time, felt solid. The changing of the seasons marked the passage of time at Blackwood. The violent autumn storms gave way to the first hard frosts of winter, which silvered the lawns each morning and left the air sharp and clean. The library, with its roaring fire, became an even greater sanctuary. Eleanor's work progressed at a steady, satisfying pace. The chaos was receding, shelf by shelf, revealing the magnificent collection that lay beneath. Her catalogue grew into a formidable volume of its own, a testament to her diligence. The Duke's presence became a fixed part of her daily landscape. The brandy on the stormy night had dissolved the layer of formality between them. Their conversations, though still infrequent, grew in substance. He would ask her opinion on rebinding a rare text or the best method for preserving fragile maps. He began to solicit her advice not just on the library, but on the house itself. He showed her the estate ledgers, a tangled mess left by a succession of indifferent stewards, and she, in turn, showed him her father's system, a model of clarity and logic.
He would watch her as she explained the principles of cross-referencing and double-entry bookkeeping, his expression one of intense concentration. "You see patterns others miss," he remarked one afternoon, looking from her neat figures to her face. "You see the structure beneath the surface." It was the most profound compliment she had ever received, for it was an acknowledgement of her mind, the part of herself she valued most. In his presence, she felt not like a plain sister or a paid employee, but like a skilled artisan appreciated by a discerning patron. It was a heady, dangerous feeling. One morning, a package arrived for her. It was a small, heavy box, and inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a set of librarian's tools. Bone folders of varying sizes, a delicate awl, fine linen thread, and a block of pure beeswax. There was no card, but she knew with absolute certainty who had sent for them. It was a gesture of profound understanding, a gift that spoke directly to the work that defined her. It was more personal, more intimate than any jewel or flower.
She ran her fingers over the smooth, cool bone, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. That afternoon, when he came to the library, she simply said, "Thank you for the tools. They are precisely what I needed." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm glad they are of use." And that was all. But the quiet acknowledgement resonated in the space between them, a shared secret that deepened their unspoken connection. Dearest viewers, if you're enjoying Eleanor's quiet journey and the slow thaw of the Duke, might I invite you to subscribe? It ensures you won't miss a single moment of their story. And for those of you already with us, perhaps you could leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. It is a joy to imagine you all gathered around this story from so many different places. Now, let us return to Blackwood Manor, where winter is tightening its grip, and two solitary people are finding warmth in the most unexpected of places. Her quiet world was interrupted by a letter from her mother, the frantic, looping script a stark contrast to the order she had imposed on her life. The letter was a litany of social anxieties. Rosamond was growing despondent. The season was advancing, and no suitable offer had been made. The Duke of Allister had not been seen in London for months. Was he ill? Was he in seclusion? Had Eleanor seen him? Was he well? The questions were a thin veneer over the real inquiry. Was he still a viable prospect? Eleanor read the letter with a sense of weary detachment. The concerns of that life seemed trivial, the ambitions hollow. She was living in a world of substance, of history and knowledge. She was earning her own way. She folded the letter without replying. What could she possibly say? That the Duke was well? That he spent his afternoons in the library? That he had a quiet, dry wit that only emerged when discussing the follies of ancient philosophers? That the sound of his voice in the quiet room had become as comforting to her as the crackle of the fire? Her work led her to a small, locked secretary desk in a dusty corner of the library. It was not on any of the old inventories. When she mentioned it to the Duke, he frowned, a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, in his eyes. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "I had forgotten it was here." He produced a small, ornate key from a drawer in his own desk and handed it to her. "See what is inside. If there are books, catalog them. If they are personal effects, set them aside for me." When she opened the desk, she found it was not filled with books. It was filled with letters, tied in bundles with faded silk ribbons. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. They were his mother's papers. Eleanor knew she should close the desk immediately, but one bundle had come loose, and a single sheet had fallen out.
Her eyes caught a line of script. I fear Alistair will never recover from Miss Ashworth's betrayal. He has built a wall around his heart, and I do not know if anyone will ever find the gate. Eleanor's breath hitched. She quickly pushed the letter back into the bundle, her cheeks burning as if she had been caught spying. The Duke's wound. The source of his coldness, his policy of mistrust. A beautiful fiancée. A betrayal. It explained everything. It explained his clinical assessment of Rosamond, his immediate assumption that beauty was a mask for deceit. It explained his initial dismissal of Eleanor herself. In a world of beautiful deceivers, a plain woman was, at least, presumably, honest. She carefully removed all the bundles of letters, retied the one that had come loose, and placed them in a neat stack on the corner of his desk. She did not read another word. When he entered the library later that day, he saw the stack immediately. He walked over to it, his expression guarded. There were no books, Eleanor said quietly, her eyes fixed on her work.
Only personal correspondence. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the letters. He touched the top bundle, his fingers tracing the faded ribbon. He knew, she was certain, that she could have read them. She could have learned the intimate details of his past, the source of his deepest pain. He knew, and he knew that she had not. It was a test of character she hadn't even realized she was taking. "Thank you, Miss Vance," he said, his voice unusually soft. He picked up the letters and carried them to the fire. For a moment, she thought he would burn them. Instead, he simply stood there, holding them, as if weighing the past in his hands. He did not return to his chair that day. He left the library, taking the letters with him, and for the first time in weeks, she was truly alone in the vast room. He did not come to the library the next day, or the day after. His absence was a palpable void, a silence that was no longer comfortable, but empty. Eleanor found her concentration wavering. Her ordered world felt suddenly precarious. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the quiet rhythm of their shared solitude. Without him, the room felt cold, despite the fire. On the third day, as dusk was falling and she was preparing to leave, he appeared in the doorway. He looked tired. There were new lines of strain around his eyes. He walked not to his chair, but to her work table. He stood before her, and for the first time, he seemed entirely without his ducal armor. He looked simply like a man, weary and burdened. "Miss Ashworth," he began, his voice low and raspy, as if he had not spoken in days. Her name was Clarissa Ashworth. She was considered the most beautiful woman of her debut season. He paused, his gaze distant. I was young. I believed that beauty was a reflection of inner virtue. A foolish assumption. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap. She did not speak. She simply listened. We were to be married, he went on. The week before the wedding, I discovered she had been selling information about my family's shipping interests to a rival. She had also been indiscreet with my cousin, the one from whom I inherited this title. He gave a short, bitter laugh. She confessed it all. She said she had never cared for me, only for the title and the fortune she believed I would one day possess. She saw me as a means to an end. He fell silent, the story hanging in the air between them, stark and ugly. Since then, he said, his voice regaining some of its usual control, I have made it a policy to trust what is tangible, what is proven. I trust ledgers and land surveys and the evidence of my own eyes. I do not trust surfaces. He finally looked at her, his grey eyes searching her face. That evening, at the ball, I saw your sister, and all I could see was Clarissa Ashworth. I saw a beautiful surface, and I assumed the rest. Eleanor's heart was hammering against her ribs. She could barely breathe. "And then I looked at you," he said, his voice dropping lower still. "And I saw someone plain, unadorned. And I made another assumption, that you were merely functional." He said the word as if it were a confession of a crime. What I said to Ashworth in the gallery that night was born of that cynical policy. It was an error of judgment, a profound one. It was an injustice to you, Miss Vance, and for that, I am truly sorry. The apology, when it came, was not grand or effusive. It was simple, direct, and stripped of all excuse. It was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her. He had remembered his exact words. He had acknowledged the precise nature of his wrong. He had offered restitution not in flowery phrases, but in the plain, hard currency of truth. Eleanor looked down at her hands. The fortress, she thought, was not competence after all. It was integrity. And his, in this moment, was absolute. "Your Grace," she said, and was surprised to find her voice was steady. "You have judged my work here to be satisfactory. You have treated me with respect in this house. The past is the past. Let us speak of it no more." It was an absolution, a closing of a ledger. He seemed to understand. A visible tension left his shoulders. He gave a single, slow nod. He did not say thank you. He did not need to. The understanding that passed between them was more complete than any words. He had shown her his wound, and she had not flinched. She had shown him grace, and he had accepted it. The dynamic between them had shifted for the final time. They were no longer employer and employee. They were a man and a woman, alone in a library, with the truth laid bare between them. The quiet accord established between them settled into a new, deeper rhythm. The winter deepened, blanketing the estate in a thick layer of snow and isolating Blackwood from the rest of the world. For Eleanor, it was not a confinement, but a peaceful enclosure. The library was her world, and the Duke was its other inhabitant. His apology had cleared the air, removing the last barrier of formality and mistrust. He began to call her Eleanor, his use of her Christian name a quiet, deliberate signal of the change between them. She, in turn, began to call him Alistair, though only in the sanctuary of the library. Their conversations ranged far beyond the books that surrounded them. He spoke of his plans for the estate, his desire to improve the tenant farms and restore the neglected woodlands. He valued her opinion, listening intently as she offered suggestions based on her father's practical knowledge. She discovered he possessed a keen, analytical mind, a deep sense of duty, and a dry wit that surfaced at unexpected moments. He, in turn, seemed to take a quiet pleasure in drawing her out, in discovering the well-furnished rooms of her mind that had been hidden from the world for so long. He learned of her childhood, of her scholarly father who had treated her as his intellectual heir. She spoke of her love for order, for the simple, irrefutable beauty of a balanced equation or a well-organized archive. He listened, his gray eyes full of a new, warm light she had never seen there before. He was not just seeing her competence, he was seeing her. And in being seen so completely, Eleanor felt herself quietly bloom. The shadow was receding, not because the light upon her had grown brighter, but because she was learning to generate her own. One afternoon, he found her staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape. "What are you thinking, Eleanora?" he asked softly.
I was thinking, she said without turning, that I have never been happier.
The admission surprised her as much as it did him. It was a simple, unadorned truth. He came to stand beside her, his shoulder almost touching hers. They looked out at the silent, white world together. "Nor I," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The moment was fragile, perfect. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke further, but the air between them was charged with unspoken feeling. It was a feeling more profound than the giddy infatuations she had witnessed in London ballrooms. It was a quiet, solid thing, built slowly from respect, understanding, and shared solitude. It was a fortress they had constructed together. This peaceful idyll was shattered by the arrival of an urgent messenger, his horse lathered and steaming in the frigid air. The message was for Eleanora. It was from her sister. Their mother had fallen ill with a severe inflammation of the lungs, and the family's financial situation, always precarious, had finally collapsed. A creditor was threatening to seize the house. Rosamond's letter was a torrent of panic and despair. She was helpless. She did not know what to do. Eleanora read the letter, her face pale. The world she had left behind had intruded with a brutal, chaotic force. Alistair, who had been there when the messenger arrived, watched her, his expression grim. "You must go to them," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said, her mind already racing, calculating, planning. "I must. I will come with you," he said. She looked at him surprised. "That is not necessary, Your Grace. It is a family matter." "It is no longer merely a family matter," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It is a matter of logistics and finance, areas in which I can be of assistance." He was offering his help not as a suitor or a savior, but as a partner, a fellow strategist. He was respecting her competence, even in a moment of crisis. "Pack what you need. My carriage will be ready in an hour." The journey south was a stark reversal of her trip to Blackwood. They traveled with speed and purpose, the comfort of the Duke's well-sprung carriage a strange contrast to the turmoil in Eleanora's heart. Alistair was a calm, steady presence beside her. He did not offer empty platitudes or reassurances. Instead, he asked precise, practical questions. Who was the creditor? What was the total of the outstanding debt? Were the household accounts in order? Eleanora, drawing on the knowledge her father had given her and the confidence she had gained at Blackwood, answered him clearly and concisely. She laid out the situation without emotion or embellishment. He listened, nodding, his mind clearly working. By the time they reached London, they had a plan. They arrived at the small, familiar house to a scene of controlled chaos. A doctor was just leaving, his expression grave. Rosamond, her beautiful face stained with tears, flew to Eleanora. "Oh, Nora, it is all a disaster. Mamma is so ill, and Mr. Finch is threatening to have us thrown into the street." Her eyes then fell on the tall, imposing figure behind her sister. "Your Grace," she whispered, her face a mixture of shock and awe. Alistair inclined his head. "Miss Vance." His voice was coolly formal. He then turned his attention to Eleanora, completely ignoring Rosamond's star-struck gaze. "Where are the ledgers?" The reversal of roles was absolute. Rosamond, the celebrated beauty, was helpless and distraught. Eleanora, the quiet shadow, was in command. For the next 2 days, she and Alastair worked from her father's small desk. They went through the accounts, the letters from creditors, the household bills. It was Eleanor who identified several assets the family possessed that could be liquidated. A small, forgotten parcel of land inherited from her grandmother. A collection of rare books her father had owned. It was Alastair who dealt with the creditor, Mr. Finch, his ducal authority and cold, unyielding logic quickly reducing the belligerent man to a state of cowed compliance. He did not simply pay the debt. He negotiated it down, restructured it, and arranged for the sale of the assets to cover it, all while treating Eleanor as his lead counsel. Rosamond watched them, her expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, painful understanding. She saw her sister not as the plain, quiet girl who held the candles, but as a woman of formidable intelligence and strength. She saw the Duke of Alastair look at Eleanor with a respect and admiration he had never once shown her. The entire world, as Rosamond had understood it, had been turned on its head. On the 3rd day, their mother's fever broke. The crisis had passed. The family's finances, while not prosperous, were stable. Order had been restored. As Eleanor stood in the drawing room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows, Rosamond approached her. "I never knew," Rosamond said, her voice small. "All those hours you spent with Papa at his desk. I thought you were just hiding. I never understood what you were doing." "I was learning," Eleanor said simply. "He sees it," Rosamond continued, glancing toward the door where the Duke had just passed. "The Duke, he sees you, Nora, in a way no one else ever has." Her eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of self-pity. They were tears of recognition. "I am so sorry. For everything." Eleanor placed a hand on her sister's arm. It was the first time she had ever truly felt like the older sister. "There is nothing to forgive." Later that evening, Alastair found her in the small, overgrown garden behind the house. The air was cold, but the first hints of spring were there, the smell of damp earth, the tight, hard buds on the rose bushes. "Your mother is recovering," he said. "The accounts are settled. Your work here is done." "Our work," she corrected quietly. He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his severe features. "Our work," he agreed. He took a step closer. "I must return to Blackwood tomorrow. I find the place is disordered, without its archivist." The words were simple, but their meaning was immense. He was not speaking of the library. He was speaking of his life. "The library is nearly finished," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The catalogue is almost complete." "A house is more than a collection of books," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It requires a curator, a keeper, someone who understands its structure, who sees its value beneath the dust." He reached out and took her hand. His grasp was warm and firm. "Eleanor, I've come to see that my house is not in order without you. Nor is my life." He was not offering a title or a fortune or a place in society. He was offering a partnership. He was offering to make her the mistress of the world she had so carefully and quietly built for herself. She looked up at him, at the man who had once dismissed her as a shadow, and saw in his eyes her own reflection, clear and bright and whole. She saw a future filled with quiet days, the scent of old books, the warmth of a fire, and the steady, unwavering presence of a man who saw her, truly saw her, for everything she was. "Yes," she said. The single word was all that was needed. It was an answer, a promise, and the beginning of a new, perfectly balanced ledger. He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze never leaving hers, and in the fading light of a London afternoon, the woman who had spent her life holding the candle was finally bathed in a light all her own.